Why would a rich man spend a fortune building a ship he already knew would be destroyed? Not lost, not wrecked by bad luck, destroyed, deliberately on a schedule he set himself after only a handful of voyages. He knew on the day the keel was laid, roughly the year his beautiful new ship would be pulled apart for its timber and sold off in pieces. And he built it anyway. He built it because of that. The short life of the ship was not the risk of the business. It was the point of the business. And by the time this ledger is finished, you are going to understand why the smartest thing an owner could do with the most expensive merchant ship on Earth was to make sure it died right on time. So hold on to the question the whole way through. Why build something magnificent on purpose to throw it away? Start with the ship itself, because you need to feel how much money we are talking about before any of this makes sense. An East Indiaman was not an ordinary merchant vessel. It was the largest, most expensive trading ship of its entire age, a floating fortress, hundreds of tons of seasoned oak, 3 towering masts, rows of gun ports like a warship, a hull built thick enough to cross the whole planet and survive the crossing. These were the ships that sailed from Europe to India and China and back, gone for a year or two at a time, carrying tea and silk and spice and porcelain worth more than most towns. To build one took a fortune. To fit it out and send it to sea took a second fortune on top. And you have just done exactly that. You are standing on the deck of the single most valuable thing a private person of your century could own. It feels like the very summit of ambition. Now here is the first strange thing, the thing that makes no sense yet. You, the man who just spent all that money, are already planning the day you will tear it down. You expect this ship to make only a small number of voyages, a few round trips to the east, and then be finished, worn out, broken up. And you are not upset about that. You budgeted for it. You are, in a sense, looking forward to it. To understand why a sane man would think that way, you have to stop looking at the ship and start looking at who is really paying you. Because you have made an assumption about your own business that is completely wrong. You think you are in the trade. You are not. Picture what you imagine you do for a living. You own this great ship, so surely you fill it with your own tea, your own silk, sail east, sail high, sail home rich. That is the fantasy, and it is not how it worked. The trade to the east, the buying, the selling, the monopoly on the whole ocean of goods, that did not belong to you. It belonged to the company. One enormous chartered monopoly held the exclusive legal right to that commerce, and a private man like you was not allowed to simply compete with it. The profit on the tea was theirs. So if the cargo isn't yours and the trade isn't yours, then what exactly did you buy when you bought this ship? Here is the answer, and it is the hinge the whole story turns on. The company, the richest, most powerful commercial body in the world, very often did not own the ships that carried its goods. It hired them. It rented them, voyage by voyage, from private owners, from men like you. You did not buy a way into the tea trade. You bought a ship to lease to the monopoly that controlled it. You are a landlord, and your tenant is the most powerful company on Earth. Now the short life of the ship starts just barely to make sense, but stay with me, because the real trick is still hidden. Look at how the money actually reaches you. You do not get paid when the tea sells. You get paid to carry it. The company agrees to hire your ship for a voyage and pay you a set rate for every ton she carries, freight. That is your income. It arrives whether the company's tea sells brilliantly in London or sits rotting in a warehouse. Their trade, their gamble, their problem. Your ship simply has to make the journey and deliver the hold, and the freight is owed to you either way. Think about what that means next to the man who owns an ordinary merchant ship and lives or dies on whether his own cargo turns a profit. You have cut that worry away entirely. You are not betting on the market.
You are collecting rent from the one institution that cannot easily go broke. And it was good rent. The rates the company paid to hire ships were high, high enough that men fought, schemed, and paid dearly to get their vessel into that service and keep it there. Because a place in the company's fleet was not really a shipping job. It was closer to owning a stall in the only market in town, where the landlord is guaranteed, the rent is generous, and the customer never leaves. So the question sharpens. If this is such a comfortable, protected income, a rich monopoly paying you steady rent to carry its goods, why on earth would you build the ship to fall apart after only a few trips?
To answer that, you have to look at what the sea actually did to these ships, and then at something far cleverer that men built on top of it. The voyage to the east was merciless on a hull. Years in warm tropical water where worms ate into the timber. Months of pounding through storms around the Great Capes. Long, hot, wet passages that rotted wood and strained every joint. An East Indiaman came home from a few of these voyages genuinely worn. Tired timber, weakened frame, expensive to keep patching. So there was a real physical reason these ships had short working lives. That part is just the ocean doing what the ocean does. If that were the whole story, the short life would simply be a cost, a sad, expensive fact of the trade. But it was not simply a cost, because the men who owned these ships had arranged something around that worn-out hull that turned its death from a loss into the most valuable thing they owned. They had found a way to make the destruction of the ship pay them. And once you see how, you will understand why an owner would look at his magnificent vessel, know it was doomed, and smile. The wearing out was not the end of his investment. It was the renewal of it. Here is the machine at the center of everything. Slow right down, because this is the answer to the question I asked you at the start. A place in the company's service, the right to have your ship hired, voyage after voyage, at that generous guaranteed rate, was not something you rented anew each time and hoped to keep. It became something an owner held almost as property, a hereditary right. If you owned a ship that held one of these places in the fleet, then when that ship wore out and reached the end of her days, you did not lose your place in the line. You held the recognized right to build her replacement and to bring that new ship straight into the same guaranteed service, inheriting the same protected income. The worn-out hull was your ticket. Its death was what entitled you to build the next one and keep collecting. Now the whole thing turns over and shows you its real shape. The ship was never the asset. The place was the asset. That protected, inheritable seat in the monopoly's fleet, throwing off guaranteed rent for as long as you kept feeding it new hulls. And to keep the seat, you had to keep the ships turning over. A vessel had to age, retire, and be replaced, so that your right to build the replacement stayed alive and unquestioned. Building the ship to die on schedule was how you renewed a franchise that could, in principle, pay your family forever. It also quietly locked outsiders out. A newcomer with fresh money could not simply walk in and offer to carry the company's goods. The places were already spoken for, held by the same families and syndicates, passed down and rebuilt, hull after hull. You had not bought a ship. You had bought a hereditary license to be paid, wrapped around a wooden object you were always deliberately in the middle of replacing.
And now, just when you think you understand who was getting rich here, the ledger shows you something that turns it over one more time. Because it was not really you. Look down the deck at the man who commands your ship, the captain. On paper, he is your employee, hired to sail your vessel. In practice, the command of an East Indiaman was one of the most sought-after prizes in the entire maritime world, and men paid staggering sums to get it, thousands of pounds handed over to acquire a single captaincy, as though buying a business. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a mere job? Because the captain held a private right that was worth more than his wages ever hinted. He was permitted to carry a quantity of goods of his own on your ship, on the company's voyage, His private trade. His own tea, his own silk, his own little cargo tucked into the hold, bought cheap in the East and sold dear at home, the profit entirely his. And that privilege was so valuable that a handful of successful voyages could make a captain a genuinely wealthy man, sometimes wealthier, ship for ship, than the owner whose vessel he sailed. So count the hands reaching into this one hull. The company takes the profit of the monopoly trade. You, the owner, take the guaranteed rent and the inheritable place. The captain takes a private fortune smuggled inside his legal privilege. 3 separate parties, each pulling steady money out of the same ship, each protected in his own way. And not one of them is doing the plain, honest, risky thing you thought you were doing when you bought her. Everyone at this table is collecting a rent of some kind. The open sea, the real gamble, the merchant's dice throw, that was for other smaller men in other smaller ships. There is one more thing to weigh before we close, and it is the cost hiding under all this comfort. Nothing this protected comes free. Look at where your money actually sits. It is locked inside a very expensive hull, gone for a year or 2 at a time, unreachable while she is at sea. And then, the moment she comes home worn out, you are expected to pour another fortune straight into building her successor. Your capital is never really released. It rolls out of one hull and into the next, tied up almost permanently in oak and canvas and the endless business of replacement. You have traded away your freedom, the liquid, ready money that lets a man seize a sudden chance, in exchange for that safe, inheritable rent. You are rich in the way a great estate is rich, powerful, secure, and almost impossible to turn back into cash in a hurry. And that is the real trade you made, the one nobody put on the bill of sale. You bought certainty, and you paid for it with flexibility. The ordinary ship owner out in the open market, betting on his own cargoes, could be ruined in a season, but he could also double his money in one lucky voyage and walk away free. You cannot be easily ruined, and you cannot easily break free either. You have chained your family's fortune to a permanent seat in someone else's monopoly, and to keep that seat, you must keep building ships whose only certain destiny is to be torn down again. It is a golden cage, comfortable, protected, generous, and locked on purpose by your own hand.
So, let's close the accounts the way an owner has to once the wonder of standing on that great deck wears off. Was owning an East Indiaman a good business? On paper, it looked like the very peak of trade. The biggest ship, the richest route, tea and silk and porcelain from the other side of the world. But open the ledger, and it was never really a trade at all. You did not gamble on cargo. The monopoly did that. You did not chase the market, you collected a guaranteed rent from it. You held a protected, inheritable seat in the most powerful company on earth, and you defended that seat by building magnificent ships and destroying them on schedule, precisely so your right to build the next one would never lapse. The short life of the ship was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan. Every doomed hull renewed a franchise worth more than the hull ever was. So the man who built a ship to die was not a fool, and he was not unlucky. He understood something the dreamer on the dock never will. The ship was never the point. The ship was the price of admission to something far better than a ship, a permanent, inherited place at the table where the world's richest monopoly quietly paid you and your children after you to hold the door. You were not a merchant with a vessel. You were a landlord whose estate happened to be made of oak and happened to sail to China, and, by careful and deliberate design, to fall to pieces right on time, so that you could have the pleasure of building it and owning it all over again. If sitting at this table changes how you see it, if you would rather understand how these fortunes were really built than watch one more proud owner mistake a ship for a business, then pull up a chair and stay a while. The accounts here are always open, and there is always another hull to take apart, plank by plank, to see who was really getting paid. Subscribe and take your seat at the table. This is Owning History, where history opens its account books.